Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. This podcast explores how authors create a world that we can escape into. Join me as we demystify the magic that keeps us turning the page. Hello, I'm Elena Bowes, host of Elena Meets the Author. Today, I'm speaking with Beatriz Williams, who has written several New York Times bestsellers. Her latest book, Husbands and Lovers, is a great, complex, and highly readable story about two remarkable women separated by decades and continents. Their only connection seems to be a family heirloom, a gold bracelet with a cobra on it. This is a story of love and heartbreak, full of secrets and twists and turns. Hello, Beatriz. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you could join us. I love this book. I couldn't put it down.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we discuss Husbands and Lovers, I looked on your website trying to figure out how many books you'd written, and you are so prolific. And you've written under your own name, under pseudonyms, and you've also co-authored a few books with two other writers. So how many books have you written? And then which ones become Beatriz Williams versus the pseudonym versus the co-author? How do you decide?
No, that's literally the most difficult. You're leading off with the hardest question. And I can't give you an exact number. I do have, I think this is number 16 of my books. I could be wrong. Of my Beatriz, but again, it's because there are all these. So I sort of like lose track just because I'm trying to remember which ones we're talking about. So I have the ones, yes, that I write by myself. Those are kind of my core books. And
right.
I can't remember the exact number. This is so embarrassing, but
impressive.
But I also have 8 books that I wrote as Juliana Gray, which was my originally historical romance pseudonym. The last 2 were actually historical mystery, but I haven't actually written those in a while, just long explanation to do with the vagaries of the publishing industry and just the fact that people seem to be buying more of my Beatriz Williams books. So we kind of focused on that. But I also have books, yes, that I write with my 2 very dear friends who are also best-selling authors, Karen White and Lauren Willig. And our 5th collaboration will be coming out in November, and it's called The Author's Guide to Murder. So those are kind of, I want to say, my fun books, although, we started doing them just because we love each other so much as sort of a friendship thing. And they did really well. So we kept doing them. We do about one every 2 years. So the long way of saying it's complicated.
It's very complicated. And then how long, for the books that under your name, how long does it take you to typically write one?
It depends because, I tend to spend a lot of time cogitating the book. So that when I sit down to write it, I love to be in that state of flow, that creative flow state where everything is coming together and your characters like your own children. And you just have this wonderful state of creative, dopamine hits coming at you all morning long, all evening long while you're writing it. So I love to be in that state. So I tend to do a lot of preparation before I write the book. And I don't mean plotting per se. I just mean thinking about the characters, thinking about the key scenes in the book, the key sort of inflection points in the character arc. And then I sit down to write the book. And so that actual drafting of the book, if I've done my preparation and obviously the historical research as well, tends to take 2 to 3 months, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, again, depending on the complexity of the book and how well I've prepared and whether my characters throw any curveballs at me. I love that serendipity of writing where once the characters are there on the page, that's when the alchemy really happens.
I love it. So rather quickly, but there's tons of work that happens before you start writing.
Yes, exactly.
Another question I had is that just when I looked at your background, so you're originally from Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from San Francisco originally. And then you went to Stanford.
Yes.
And then you went to Columbia Business School, where my son's going. now. But how did you get into writing with that?
Well, that question comes up a lot. And my usual answer is that it's sort of, you kind of have to look at the question the other way around. I'm someone who always wanted to write, come from a very nerdy background, was always writing, went to all this sort of Shakespeare and opera as a kid. My dad was a civil engineer. My mom was a homemaker. We were definitely not any kind of wealthy family, but we would just go to these things in our dresses from the Sears catalog. And that was my best. So I always wanted to write stories, and particularly historical novels. So why did I end up going into sort of this business career? And the answer is really that being kind of a pleaser. My sister tended to be the more rebellious one. I was the one who sort of had to be constantly like trying to win my parents' approval. And so business is just something where it's easier to be successful at it. As we know, writing, as my father used to tell me, and my father is British, many are called, few are chosen. So for me, just a ton of courage, just to say, this is what I want to do and this is what I want to be. So that while I could be a completely adequate, successful, management consultant to financial companies, all I really wanted to do ever was write books.
Well, how grateful we are that you made that bold decision and rebelled, because I love this book. And now I want to talk about the book. So just to get people who haven't read it yet, I'll just go in a brief description. One of the storylines takes place in present time in the moneyed, waspy world of New England, in a fictional island called Winthrop Island, which is loosely based on Fisher's Island off the coast of Connecticut. Mm-hmm. Mallory is a single mother to 10-year-old Sam, who desperately needs a kidney transplant. The one person who could be a kidney match for Mallory's adored son, Sam, is his father. But for a reason we don't learn until the final chapters of this gripping novel, Mallory refuses to approach the father, a famous musician named Monk Adams, who Mallory hasn't seen or spoken to in 14 years since the fateful summer of 2008. The other storyline takes place in Cairo in 1951 after the war. Hannah is a Hungarian refugee and is in a loveless marriage to a British diplomat. She meets Lucien, a Swiss hotel manager, after she is bitten by a cobra, and their relationship progresses from there. Both Mallory and Hannah have long buried secrets that get revealed over time. And as complicated as the two storylines and the three timelines sound, you move from 2008 to present day, from 1951 Egypt back to Hungary and World War II. But your chapter headings are so clear that I always knew exactly where I was. But I can't imagine how you plotted the story out with so many different strands. So how do you plan a book like this?
So I've always written with this at least dual timeline framework. And it's not a choice I deliberately set out to make. It was just the way I naturally approach stories. I cannot think of a story, cannot create a situation in my head without wondering how we got there. Without thinking of the timelessness of the human condition. And Mallory and Hannah, they have these two storylines that at times may not, what's the connection? How are they connected? And it's not simply that, one is grandmother and granddaughter, but that in their different time periods, in very different places, they are going through the same challenges. If you pay attention to the plot, they encounter these things kind of at the same time. Their arc goes in this parallel. And that to me is really important, teasing out the ways in which the human condition repeats itself over time. So there's always a mystery, in some kind of mystery in the past scenario that I always want to figure out before I turn to what's happening in the present day. I can't understand who my characters are in the present until I understand what's shaped them in the past. So I started with Hannah's story, and it was a little bit interrupted because my agent and I had decided we were going to move to a different publishing house. So I had to sort of stop after 3 chapters of Hannah and then start Mallory's story in the summer of 2022 and get far enough along that we had about 100 pages and so we could submit that to publishers and find my wonderful new editor at Ballantine, who I adore. So that's not my usual way of going about it. I usually write that past scenario from beginning to, either end or almost to the end until I'm like, okay, I'm really secure in what happened and who this person is and what happened to this person. And then I turn to the present day storyline, whether that present is in our past or whether it's in, the character, the character, our actual contemporary period. And then as I'm writing Mallory's story, then I realize I can't just in her head flash back to 2008. What happens in 2008 is so important that I need to give that its own chapters. So I then stopped writing 2022 and started writing 2008. And when 2008 was finished, I then finished off 2022, kind of wove them together. And then, there's sort of all important concluding chapters. But I understand that most writers who do these multiple timelines alternate, they sort of write them as you read them. I can't do that. I have to understand from start to finish. I have to be immersed in that character fully to kind of capture that voice and give that sense of, it's a bit like an actor, getting into a role. I really have to be immersed in that character. And for me, the way to do that is to write that character's story from beginning to end and then turn to the other character.
So Mallory and Hannah, sort of separately, Mallory
Yes.
and then Hannah, and then maybe interspersed. Did you always know what Mallory's secret was?
I suspected it. And what often happens to me is that I understand what it is as I go through the person in the past and and what happens to Hannah. So I knew that, and I obviously I don't want to wander into spoiler territory here.
Yeah, I know.
But there are certain family dynamics that I was picking up on right away with Mallory. And of course I'm thinking to myself, what could possibly happen that would make her walk away from this wonderful man whom she adores, who adores her. They have this wonderful relationship that goes much deeper than, just that they have this, passionate attraction to each other. It's a very deep connection. They're kind of people who get each other in a very deep way. Why would she walk away from that? It would have to be something, just really insurmountable for her. So as I got to know her character in those early chapters, I started to figure out what that was. And as soon as I figured it out, everything I'd written before started to really make sense. It's sort of like you kind of know in the back of your head what this plot twist is going to be. And then you're already writing toward it before you even realize it.
And both she and Monk are such good people. They have such good values that I think that event is very believable, her response to it.
Yeah, it was important to me. And it's funny because everyone's sort of asking me, well, what singer inspired Monk? By the time we meet him in 2022, in 2008, he's Mallory's, best friend. They've known each other since boarding school together. Mallory comes from kind of a more working class background. Monk comes from this Winthrop Island, summer aristocracy. But they connect, in boarding school. And it's this last year of college. And that's when they finally realize that they're in love with each other. And, from the moment, so for me, Monk was not a singer-songwriter. He was not this famous person, this persona that we project to the world. He is somebody else. He's just this guy who is Mallory's best friend. And when he first walked into a scene was when, Mallory's remembering the first moment that they talked to each other and they're both being dropped off at boarding school after a weekend at home. And he walks into this scene and he is just so himself. Like I knew him right away, just just knew him, knew what he would say or do in any situation. And the important thing about him is that he is this really kind person. And that is both his greatest strength and in some ways a bit of a weakness, because that's one of the reasons Mallory walks away in a way, because he's so good. And so again, I don't want to walk into spoiler territory here, but his goodness is essential to the plot. And so when he becomes famous later on in this interval, when he has no contact with Mallory, it was interesting to me how he walks into 2022 and he's still himself. Like, fame has altered the contours of his life, but it hasn't changed who he is. And I think I loved that about him most of all.
I loved that too. You describe him as being, in the beginning, well, he's so handsome. The mother whistles at him when she drops Mallory off at boarding school.
She's got a single mom who can be a little embarrassing. Yes.
Exactly. I love that scene. But I was thinking, I don't think you really described what Mallory looked like. It wasn't, I knew she was good looking-ish, but I didn't really know it until later when I hear Monk talk about her. I don't even know if you really told us what she looked like. I mean, I knew she had dark.
I tend not to do that. And it's because to me, the exact, like, some people have mood boards where they put pictures from magazines or wherever, that, inspire the character. I tend to see the characters in a very blurry way physically. I get a sense of their physicality. But I'm always getting corrected by copy editors because I change eye color or hair color or something. It's actually a struggle for me to put into words how the character looks, because to me, it's again, that sense of their physicality rather than the specifics. And of course, Mallory, she's herself. I'm always interested in, and I would say that a lot of the action in my books, the meat of my books, the heart of my books, is in that gap between persona, which is what we present to the world, and person, which is, who we are, our true selves. And we tend not to see ourselves the way others see us. And that always interests me, because we're trying to have others, or we think that others are seeing us a certain way. We react to the way we think we're being perceived, or we put up this facade to the world that this is what we want others to think of us. So I like having that when there's a final chapter from Monk's point of view, where we finally see Mallory through his eyes and we realize why he loves her so much. Because to Mallory, she's just Mallory. When we're inside Mallory's head, we just see her as she sees herself. She sees herself as being, I don't see, not exactly ordinary, but she doesn't see, and I don't want to use that cliche. I mean, she knows she's attractive. She certainly is confident in herself. But when we see from Monk's eyes, just this beauty from within that she has, I think, and that's something I'm thinking about all the time as I'm writing Mallory. I kind of couldn't wait to get into Monk's point of view so I could turn that mirror back to Mallory and say, see, this is why he loves you so much, and to me, that was just such a wonderful chapter to write, to be in his head and see how by the way, how Monk perceives himself, because we see Monk as being this incredibly charismatic guy who doesn't put a foot wrong. He sees himself as someone who's like, he hears this girl that he wants to love him. So what does he do to make sure that he's worthy of her? And I loved that turnaround so that we can see those characters the way they see each other.
When he said that he was the earth to her sun, that, towards later on.
Yes.
But also you did describe, I think in pretty good detail, his girlfriend, Lennox. Was Lennox quite fun to write?
Yeah, it's funny. I had kind of a long back and forth with my editor about this character because I didn't want to make her too unlikable. Her point was like, well, Monk is a great guy, and this woman he's with is sort of, she is, an influencer, and she sort of curates other people's creations. I mean, I think one of the key points about both Monk and Mallory is, Mallory herself is an artist. Monk is, they both create stuff. And Lennox is somebody who curates what other people create. And that was kind of important to me because, this, and again, this is the first time I've really written in the present day. And one of the things that interests me about the present day is, is social media. And again, this presenting this facade to the world, but also this whole idea of creating stuff without really creating stuff. And so I had to think about, well, why does Monk end up getting engaged to Lennox at the time that Mallory re-enters his life? And I found a way, that I don't want to sort of divulge for spoiler purposes, but in a sense, she does represent, he's looking for a safe space. And I think that, he's looking for it in 2008 because he's got this very demanding family with a lot of expectations of him. He's like their crown prince. And then in 2022, he has other reasons for needing a safe space. He has this fame, this world that he's in that is not, it's a world that he can function in, but it's not a world that feels like home to him. So he needs something that feels like home. And Lennox understands this, and she knows how to give this to him. But it's fair to say that Mallory brings out the worst in Lennox because Mallory represents a lot of things that Lennox wants to be and isn't. So it is kind of a complex dynamic and trying to make Lennox human while also saying, hey, this is why she's really not right for Monk. And this is why he can't have that same relationship with her that he has with Mallory. And he has this little soliloquy at one point where he talks about his grandfather in the war, and his grandfather brought back this story about ersatz coffee that they had to drink. It wasn't real coffee, so you couldn't get coffee beans. And so they make it out of like ground chicory and acorns and things. And it tastes terrible, but they drink it anyway because it's hot and it's comforting, even though it's not really coffee. And to me, that kind of like is right there, the core of who Monk is. Like that statement he makes to me was like, okay, this is who Monk is. And that difference between authenticity and, I don't want to say fakery exactly, but kind of a replacement for authenticity that fills us without really kind of being what we really want and need.
No, without that whole story that Monk told her about the coffee was excellent. And you see that Lennox is, she's always on her phone, and Mallory is always not on her phone. And sometimes she misses calls.
She can't be. I think for a long time, Mallory doesn't want to be found. So she kind of has to stay off of social media. And, and it's funny, when I was recreating 2008, and I myself had a baby in 2008. I had my fourth child in 2008. And so it's funny kind of mentally going back to that, because when you have small children, everything's a bit of a blur. But the main difference, and I put in a few references to song titles, what's interesting to me is, and like what the girls are wearing. Remember, there's really low cut jeans they used to wear and that kind of thing. So there's little things, but there's also what is not there. And what is not there, I mean, they have phones and you're texting each other, but there's no... social media is still in its infant stages, and you certainly don't have it on your phone. So there's kind of a reference to, somebody posted something on Facebook, and someone's like, well, what's Facebook? And it's like, oh, it's this new thing. It's like MySpace, but we're not on it all the time. And as the mother of, two children who hit puberty before, social media, and two kids who hit puberty after social media, I can tell you, the differences in their experience is like vast. 2008 to me was almost defined more by what is not there than what is there. Because of course, by 2022, we're full on, we're all in with social media and kind of living our lives online.
Which is why I also loved Lennox's character, because she exists very much now. And you see 2008 and then you see now, and there's a big difference. But
she's a woman whose time has come, I guess.
Exactly. Exactly. You have said, I think on your website, that the truths I want to illuminate come from historical details, not historical events writ large, from human dramas, not from headlines. In your author's note, you tell the reader about some of the historical details that inspired this novel. Can you expand on that here?
Yeah, so I knew, and again, so we've sort of been talking a lot about Monk and Mallory, and Hannah's story is so important to me. It was really the starting point for this book was Hannah's story. I had sort of read this article about somebody who'd done some DNA research on her family, and it turned out her mother had been adopted out of an Irish orphanage in the 50s, and she was a product of an affair, and that affair had taken place. And I couldn't remember the details, but somewhere in the British Empire, and there had been a hotel manager this woman had an affair with. So I had already thought, wow, that sounds like a good Beatrice novel right there. This is exactly that kind of, again, human drama taking place against a backdrop of historical events. And so when I started developing this idea in my head, I was thinking, well, where should I set this? And again, my father's British, my grandparents. So I have a good sense for what that was like being a British expat and what your life was like and how you viewed the world. And my father was born in 1946 in Calcutta. So I thought, well, where would I set this? And I ended up thinking about, well, what about Egypt? And one of the reasons was I had just finished writing 2 Cold War set novels. And so to me, the Cold War was very much front and center of what I was thinking about and the way it sort of shaped the second half of the 20th century. And I'm looking at Egypt and I'm thinking, well, Suez Crisis, 1950. This is a major kind of seismic event for the British Empire, because this is the moment where it's kind of a tipping point almost, where gosh, we can't hang on to this any longer. And so I thought, well, Suez Crisis, and especially because the Suez Crisis reached its climax about the same time, in fact, over the exact same few days as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which is then brutally put down by the Soviets, such that Hungary never really rises again until the fall of communism. So I wanted to kind of find a way to link these two, which is why Hannah ended up being Hungarian. But then as I'm doing my research in Egypt in 1956, and I'm studying the Suez Crisis, and I'm thinking, okay, hotels, well, it's got to be Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo. That's the, the iconic hotel. And then as I'm doing my research on Shepherd's, I realized that Shepherd's burned to the ground in January of 1952 during this night of fires in downtown Cairo, that kind of all the sort of British targets were burned to the ground. And then you have the Egyptian Revolution a little bit later in the year. So I'm thinking, wow, this is actually not just interesting historically, but makes a really good climactic moment for my characters in Egypt. And then as I do my research and I started reading, I was looking for memoirs, because to me, that's a great way to find out, well, what is it like to be a human being living in this particular period? And all the memoirs that I was able to discover that reflected that period, post-war Egypt, were written by Jewish people who had been forced out of the country during that period of time. And the process by which they were forced out reminded me so much of 1930s Germany, where you strip away rights and these people are saying, hang on, I'm Egyptian. My family's lived here for centuries. And some came out of Spain when they were kicked out during the Inquisition, and some came from Syria and Egypt, we're Egyptian. And all of a sudden you're being told, no, you're not Egyptian. Get out of here. And your property rights are stripped away. Your legal rights are stripped away. You can't even hold a bank account. You've got nothing. You have to leave. And that sense of betrayal and disbelief was really interesting. And all that kind of then came together. I thought, okay, I think this is where my story lies. This is where Hannah's story and Lucien's story lies.
God, I mean, Yeah. Very,
So
very
the
meaty.
the research will take you where you want to go, basically.
Yeah. So is that often how you get your ideas, from just sort
Yes.
of your research?
Mhm. Absolutely. I think there's no other way to do it. And again, as I said, it's not necessarily the historical events that interest me or the historical figures. And there's obviously some wonderful biographical fiction out there. But what I am interested in is what was life like for people who were living it. I would say ordinary people, but of course, you always want your main characters to be a little bit more than ordinary, someone really interesting, doing interesting things, because that makes for a good plot. But I mean, what was it like for just somebody who was there experiencing this? And I think that again comes from this background, all this sort of Shakespeare and opera and all these 19th century British novels that my father would toss at me to keep me quiet, was they're not historical fiction, other than maybe the history plays and a couple of history operas. They're contemporary fiction, just happen to be written during a historical period. So it's not about it is, for the characters in my books, I try to remember that this is not, to them, this is not historical fiction. This is contemporary. This is their own life. And they happen to be living in this period where, change is happening. So what was that like? And what makes these great works so great is that they're not about the events themselves. They are about the human condition. And what is interesting is how little the human condition has changed over time, and despite all this history taking place in the meantime. And so that's what I want to get to the heart of. And the 20th century is so particularly interesting because there is so much change, so much plot is going on. So what was it like to be an actor in the middle of all that?
I read that a book that really got your passion in 20th century history was Vera Britton's book,
Yes.
Testament of Youth.
Testament of Youth. Mm-hmm.
And I haven't read it. Is that done what you're talking about very much from the eyes of people then?
So exactly. So Vera Britton was, in the summer of 1914, was a kind of an upper middle class girl from Derbyshire. And her brother had gone to boarding school. She, of course, had not, being a girl, but she was very, very bright, wanted to go to Oxford, sort of managed to get herself in by taking entrance examinations and so on. So she was about to start at Oxford. So was her brother at the same time, and her brother's best friend, who was also someone she was, they were at this moment falling in love. And then, of course, Guns of August, the war starts. And instead of starting at Oxford, she becomes a nurse. So she trains as a nurse and ends up nursing throughout the war, ends up at a field hospital in northern France. And in the meantime, first her fiance dies, who is this classic, if Monk Adams is based on anyone, it might be Roland Leighton. And he's just sort of that guy who, he's athletic, and they all have this sort of officer training corps, and he's the color sergeant of the officer training. They all have them in these British boarding schools. It's just considered important to train officers, at an early age. So he was color sergeant of the officer training corps.
Color sergeant?
So that was like the guy. He was the the main, I guess the main cadet.
Okay.
He was the the leader, the captain of them. I think it was called the color sergeant. And he sort of won the list of all the year-end awards, and he won just about every single one, from the mathematics medal to Latin poetry to that kind of guy. Yeah. And not only that, he's a feminist. His mother was an author who supported the family. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, so I relate to that as the breadwinner of my family, and so he's really supporting Vera as she's trying to get into Oxford and going to Oxford. He thinks that's wonderful. So he's all these things, and writes beautiful letters to her, of course. And then in December of 1915, just as he's about to head back to Britain on Christmas leave, he is shot through the stomach by a sniper with an exploding bullet, dies in agony the next day. And, it's because he's leading a party out to repair wire. And of course, you're the lieutenant, even though you're 19 years old. And so
Right.
you lead the party. That's your job. And this so devastated me reading this and reading just these lives of these people who seemed very much people I could relate to. And it devastated me. And I sort of shifted away from the way I had as a kid, as a young adult, been so focused on, Georgian literature, Victorian literature. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, I kind of walk away from that capital R romantic world into this transition to the modern world, into modernism, and how 1914 changed who we are as a society. And that became so interesting to me that it ended up being the focus of what I ended up writing.
Fascinating.
Once I plucked up the courage to do it.
No, it's great. I think you did the right thing. Present day Winthrop Island.
Yes.
So completely different than Cairo. And I love the juxtaposition of the two places. I mean, that's this dual timeline and dual places, I think really adds to a story, actually. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I loved reading about, the love story between Mallory and Monk set on a beach in summer. Mm-hmm. Beaches have a recurring theme in your novel. In fact, Winthrop Island has appeared in 2 earlier novels of yours. Yes. What is it about beaches that attracts you?
So it's funny. I would actually say I'm really more of an autumn person than a summer person per se. What happened was I wrote a book called 100 Summers. It was my second published novel. It came out in 2013. And it happened to be set on, I became very interested in the hurricane of 1938, which hit New England and with devastating force. And I had grown up on the West Coast, but then when I moved to New York after college, and it was a bit of a reluctant move. I certainly didn't want to be a New Yorker at all, but I got a job, so I reluctantly went to New York, and there I met the man who became my husband, whose family, very much New England family. So I ended up being kind of plunged into New England culture, and became kind of, I think, having a father who's British, a lot of those elements are the same. So I was fascinated by Hurricane in 1938. I wrote a book, 100 Summers, which sort of fictionalizes the experience of Napatree Point, which is part of Watch Hill, that was devastated during this hurricane. So I wrote that book, and it goes back and forth between 1938 and an earlier love affair. And that was kind of my first hit. That did really, really well. So my publisher was like, well, let's do another summer book. So, and at that point I was writing like The Secret Life of Violet Grant and Tiny Little Thing became a little bit more of a beach book at that point, because I knew they wanted more beach, give us more beach, more summer. And so it was a little bit, and look, like I said, I'm the family breadwinner. So I want to write the books of my heart. But if, I also need to, I've got 4 kids to put through college, right? So I'm like, okay, if you want beach, if you want summer, here we are. But, that being, this is not purely a financial decision in the sense that, so much of New England culture, which had by that time really begun to fascinate me, having it's been my adopted culture. A lot of that kind of is writ large when you get to the summer, everyone returns to the same place for summer. They're like migratory birds, So I love these places like Fisher's Island, which became my fictional Winthrop Island, because you have this interesting dynamic of, the people who live there year round, and there's that culture. And then the summer people who come, they have houses there, they come, they inhabit them for the summer, and then they go back to their ordinary lives. And that really interests me. I was an anthropology major in college. So anything that has to do with hierarchies and status, and especially all this stuff that is unspoken, is of just vital interest to me, because I feel like that's like the human nature lives there. That's where human nature lives. So you have, Cairo in 1951 to 52, and you have Winthrop Island in, the 2000s. And they've both got their hierarchies. They've both got their year-rounders, and they've got the people who live on the top, on that sort of base that's been created for them. So again, there's that parallel, and yet you've got two different places and times, and yet human beings are still doing the same things. And I think that's really interesting too. So the beach, one of the things I love about the beach is there is that sense of, again, timelessness. Yes, the wind and the waves and the weather all shape beaches, but you've got this ocean out there that is like eternity. And, the beach itself has a kind of an infinite quality to it, a timeless quality to it. So I love working with that setting and playing with those ideas because they do kind of tease out a lot of the themes that go into my books.
It's funny because, as I told you earlier before, I think we were taping, so I'm from California.
Yes.
And I moved to Connecticut. And I am, after living in London for a long time, but
we have parallel lives.
We do.
Yes. I lived in London for 5 years. So
yeah, I was even longer, long time, 30, but which you can't tell. But the East Coast has this thing that I don't think exists anywhere else. It's like the way they go to summer camp, Martha's Vineyard, Maine, Nantucket, Cape Cod, these islands, and it's warm. Unlike, the West Coast, Seattle, San Francisco in the summer is not always, it can be freezing cold
Mark
water.
Twain, the coldest winter he ever spent was summer in San Francisco because the inland heat draws that cold Pacific air into
exactly. But the whole thing that when you write about these, their youth, but they're still going back there. That's very New England to me.
Yes,
they always go back. So it's perfect.
And these communities where people have to find a way to get along because they're all coming back year after year, generation after generation. I mean, even renovating the house is only done if absolutely necessary, like the roof is leaking,
Yeah.
And there's this sense of wanting to hold on to the past, which is very New England. But the fact that when we think of New England, we think of Robert Frost and we think of, snowy woods and we think of, and yet there's that New England, which is, the England of 9 months of the year. And then for 3 months of the year, they go to these beaches. So if you can afford to, I want to be very careful to sort of say, this is a slice of New England culture.
Yeah.
It's not all New England culture, but if you can at all, you go to these places and you try to at least rent a house for a couple of weeks, if not buy a house that you can stay all summer. And that sense of permanence and being anchored to a location, I think is so interesting and human and but yet unlike what we have in, I think, other parts of the country. And even, when I think of London, people would always sort of go off, they would find some beachy location that was not in England because, England's beaches are not, not always where you would want to go to,
not at all.
Lay in the sun for 2 weeks.
No, because it's reliable on the East Coast.
Yeah.
Characters. Which characters were easy to write and which less so?
Monk was very easy to write. I knew who he was, like I said, right away. Hannah was difficult. Hannah, I had so much trouble with her, and it's partly because, she's hiding so much hurt. And I knew she was hiding hurt, and I had some idea of what it was. But in the same way that she doesn't want other characters to get close to the real her, she doesn't want me to get to the real her. I had to really just sit down and write, and sometimes force myself to write because I was having so much trouble getting in her head and understanding her and making her, I guess, inhabiting her comfortably enough that I could speak for, that I could animate her on the page, if that makes sense. Instead of her being a puppet that I was trying to manipulate. You have to inhabit the character. You have to bring them to life as they are, and if you don't understand who they are, you can't do that. So it took me some time. And I really had to get to the bottom of who she was and what had happened to her. She had a first love, goes through the Second World War, she's in Hungary, she undergoes some pretty difficult things. And there are some things that happened to her that my editor actually had me take out. And because she's like, don't forget, this is a summer book. So I left a few things unspoken, especially at the end of the war. But once I got that about her and what she is looking for in Lucien, what does she need from Lucien? And once I figured that out, and I figured out sort of, I guess, peeled back all these protective layers she's got around her, then it became much easier. But she was very, very difficult in those early chapters.
I thought it was very good because she is kind of prickly.
Yes,
and
very prickly.
She's very closed. And when she's got that husband and the whole marriage and then, going out for a cigarette and the way that you describe her day, the monotony of her day and the gin and tonics and then the wine and you get this whole diplomatic life. You took your time, but you want to get to know her because there's more. Mm-hmm. And then Lucien, just like Monk, sees
beneath, I think, those protective layers, which is really what love is all about. One of the things I love about writing love stories is that they are so good at inhabiting that space that I was talking about between persona and person, because it is the job of the lover to set aside, to see through that persona, to the person inside. So that's why the love story is such a great way to mine that territory.
Yeah, to show character, the other person's character, who they see.
Exactly.
Okay, well, are you working on something now? Do you have another book coming out? What's next?
So the next book is partly set on Winthrop Island in the present day. But I always, again, history is in my blood. I can't have a story that is completely contemporary because it's just not the way
you work.
I see the world and I see people's stories.
Oh. Oh.
Some, hidden art. There's all kinds of cool stuff in there. And some of the characters, so Monk and Mallory they're cameo characters. They do walk on the page, but one of the secondary characters in Husbands and Lovers becomes a main character in this book.
Ooh.
I was very excited to be able to do that because...
Can you tell us who it is?
Character who started out as kind of a plot device, and then I realized I actually like this person a lot. And so I'm excited to be able to flesh that character out. And also goes back to some not characters, but the descendants of some characters from my previous Winthrop Island novels. So Summer Wives and Beach at Summerley.
Yeah.
A couple of descendants pop up in this book. And I love this sort of world building and world creation. So it's, I'm very excited about this one. We're about to, any day now, my editor's about to go on a month of sabbatical. So I'm waiting for the revision letter to come in before she leaves. But I've been doing a little revising myself because I can't stop tinkering. It's very hard for that when they rip the laptop out of my hands and say, we have to print this thing. You have to stop working on it. So.
Wow. And this will come out next summer.
This will be, so this will be next summer's book. Yeah. 2025. Oh my God. Next summer is 2025. We're going to be a quarter of the way through this century. How did that happen?
I know. I mean, I keep saying I can't believe summer's almost over, but you're right. 2025. Time flies.
Yes.
Time flies. Okay. Well, thank you, Beatriz. This was terrific.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
Really enjoyed listening to you and hearing all your thoughts.
My books and my characters because they're very real to me.
Yeah, that's great. And we get to read whoever the secondary character is.
Yes.
all to be disclosed. Thank you for listening to this episode. I loved what Beatriz said, that for her characters, it's not a historical novel. And I think she really pulls that off. I was just as immersed in Cairo in 1951 and Hungary before that as I was in New England in 2022. The issues we face in life happen whatever era we're in. Love, loss, social hierarchy, showing a persona to the outside world versus who we really are, and wanting to be truly seen by some. That's it for today. Please let me know what you're reading and loving. My contact details are on Instagram. See you in 2 weeks.